This panel is something that gives me a particular honor, and I'd like to explain why. My name is Tracy Sefl. I'm a Democratic consultant. I actually was a little bit late getting here this afternoon because I was on phone calls with people in Virginia, and if anyone's paying a modicum of attention, they know that the state seems to, or the Democratic Party in Virginia seems to be imploding. But it struck me as I was finally making my way over here a little late that what's happening in Virginia is in many ways a product of some of the social movement and collective action that's happening right now, and that I think this panel will be representative of in very marvelous and colorful ways. Number one, there's a hashtag #MeToo issue happening, and number two, there are some concerns over people's past usage of racist imagery. Both of those things are being dealt with largely in social media channels and largely with digital activism. And I'd like to just take a moment to look at our four panelists here, and what I see is a representation of academic understandings of social movements and social change, and some really great people who are in the middle of making that change. And to have that spectrum represented here is, it's very meaningful for me. And I hope for all of you, what's meaningful is that this is going to be the positive panel. So that's a rare thing that I get to say I'm going to be part of, is the positive panel. But there is so much here, so much that's represented. And you, of course, have everyone's biographies, but I'd like to just say briefly a few comments about these four people and things that I've come to know about them. And then I look forward to hearing from each of them and discussing further. So John, welcome. John has been using his voice in incredible ways as a student of in Parkland, as we now shorthand your school. We just call it Parkland, I think. And your I don't know where your energy is coming from, but you've been all over. You've been all over the country. You're working toward, I think, what you call a civil conversation. And those are refreshing words to hear, and it's refreshing to know that a high school student is part of leading that effort. Reaching new communities, registering more voters, all good things. And as we approach the 1-year anniversary of that tragedy, I'm very glad for you to have this platform today. So I want to thank you for that work. And yes. I'll continue with some brief introductions. Avalon, I think it makes sense to introduce you next. I think that you and John, in many ways, are sort of aspirational for all of us as to where your energy is coming from. And your work also with March for Life activities and for women's issues has been really wonderful. And I think we can offer Avalon a slightly belated birthday, that you're now 17. So I am in admiration of that as well. And one thing that I was most sort of joyful about when I was reading about everything that you're doing, Avalon, is that there's a picture that I think you're using as your Twitter profile right now that says, "The young people will win." And I love that, and I love the work you're doing, and I'm delighted that you're here. Welcome to Avalon. And Elham, thank you for being here. Santa Monica seems like a better place, but maybe next year, Eric, we'll go there. And I'm fascinated to hear more about your work, in particular, the use of social media to fight oppression. And all of those words together in a sentence is in many ways still a new thing. And it's an even newer thing when we step outside of America. And in the case of your studies and your portfolio, to be looking at Iran, and even more specifically to look at women in Iran and what they are doing as they face oppression and the way that tools can help overcome that. I have a personal interest. My husband is a first-generation Iranian American, and I am fascinated by what goes on over there, and having never visited yet, I hope that you can really provide some illustrations of your important work. So thank you and welcome, Elham. And Tony, down at the end, hello. I studied sociology throughout my whole academic life, and I left to work in politics. You are, in some ways, my hero because you have so many different subfields of sociology that you are, shall we say, crushing it. From looking at the sociology of knowledge, which was always a daunting but fascinating topic for me, and looking at the relationship between technology and racism, and looking at the way that technology can be a tool of resistance in minority communities in particular. It is a timely discussion that we're in no way going to have enough time for. But I'm grateful to know that your work is out there, and I encourage everyone to look further at Tony's CV, because there's an incredible, lots of interesting things that I would like to read on other topics. But thank you today for being here to talk about the technology of resistance. Welcome. So final word, and I'll turn this to the panelists. In framing this conference, Eric said something about how best do we make a difference? Do we need to rethink how best to make a difference? And we're going to start with John and Avalon, because they're not rethinking anything. They're just thinking. So John, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, well, oh wow. First, thank you so much for that kind introduction. So Avalon and I, we're both still in school. So we look at our textbooks, we see these huge historic events that's happened in our past, and especially in American history, and see what people have done to really make their voice heard. And specifically for me, I knew after the tragedy that struck my school, I needed to do something. I saw what other people have done in the past to make their voice heard, and I realized if I'm not going to do it, no one else is going to do it, because for so long elected officials have failed to accurately represent the youth's voice and the voice of the American people in general. So I finally realized that I had enough, especially because it affected me personally, and I spoke out about it. Yeah, that's just something personally for me. What about you, Avalon?
So yeah, my name is Avalon. I just turned 17 on Saturday. I'm the Northeast Regional Director of March for Our Lives. I'm also the National Director of Equity and Inclusion for Next Generation Politics, which is an organization that aims to foster bipartisanship among youth and engage in civil dialogue with those youths. And so when I joined March for Our Lives, it was not my first take in activism. I had grown up going to NOW meetings with my mother, the National Organization of Women for Women, and I had constantly been surrounded by the idea that it is not just okay to be silent and complacent. I'm actually a first-generation American. I always tell this story because I think it's incredibly important to contextualize where my activism came from. My mother was a religious refugee from the Soviet Union in 1975. She actually immigrated to Jackson Heights, Queens, in 1975. Didn't speak any English, didn't speak any Hebrew. She went to a small yeshiva there. And they had no money. All of their furniture in their apartment came from synagogues. And I take a lot of pride in my mother's story and how she grew up to actually go to Columbia University. And so did my father. My dad is also an immigrant. He's born in Vienna. His father was a Holocaust survivor. And I grew up constantly hearing these stories of the trials and the tribulations that my parents both went through to get to their heights of success. They're my biggest inspirations. My father is also a graduate of Columbia University, so it's especially touching to be here today, talking here about what matters most to me. So when I look at youth movements, especially the current youth movement of March for Our Lives, there's something that makes it very different, but there's some shared common themes with movements before us, because although we are just doing this on the fly, we take great pride in knowing that there were those before us that worked especially hard to create the platforms that we have today. So in my opinion, when I look at it, I see two things that remain the same: the use of pathos and the use of logos in our youth movement. So we kind of capitalize off of this sense of urgency and fear that young people have. It's not a manufactured fear, it's a fear that I've had since I was little that I didn't really know was wrong until it started coming up more in the media, and other youth started speaking out that this was wrong. This fear of sitting in my history class and thinking that, you know, maybe this cabinet was better to hide if someone came in and started shooting, or if I was in the bathroom, which window was most accessible for me to jump out of and how high was it? And these were just thoughts that I found normal. Even days after the Parkland shooting, my 12-year-old brother was talking to my mom in the car and told her that he has these thoughts, and he's never spoken to me about it. That's how normal it was in his mind. He didn't even feel like he had to address these concerns to his parents. And so the use of pathos in our movement is one that's paramount to sustaining this movement. Now, we always say it's not just a moment, it's a movement. And that's something that we use. Another thing that I found March for Our Lives uses really well is the use of logos. So using facts and statistics and reality to base our ideas and to base our movement in. Because if you're not basing it in that, you're basing it purely off of emotion. And emotion comes and goes. And people's feelings towards an issue comes and goes. People have other priorities in their life if they're not directly affected by it. So those were two consistent themes that we've had beforehand. But I think the thing that really changed was the ethos in our movement. It was the way that young people have created this national network of powerhouses that they connect with on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, via video call, to talk about really what makes our generation unique. And I also think a big part of this is kind of, unfortunately, the celebritization of these young people that have went through these tragedies. If you see even, especially in March for Our Lives, they're young people that I just consider my friends and my cohorts, but they've become sort of celebrities. For example, you all probably know the name David Hogg. You all probably know the name Emma Gonzalez. They're no different than me. They're just kids. But unfortunately, they were put in a position of either taking action so this didn't happen again, or staying silent and going through this by themselves. And we forget that these kids are traumatized. It's something I feel like we forget a lot, that all of us are traumatized in different ways, whether we've been directly affected or we've suffered the ramifications of our elected officials not putting in the work. And so I think that there's a lot that makes us similar to old movements, but our energy, like you had said, is the thing that I feel makes us different. Because we consistently talk in our circles that this isn't just something we do on the side. It's not just a hobby. It's a matter of survival. And when I talk about how it is a matter of survival, it brings me right back full circle to my family story. The very fact that I'm sitting here today is because my family survived. That's all it is. My family generationally, if you look back throughout the history of the Jewish people, were killed, enslaved, oppressed, discriminated against in this country and in the countries that my parents came from. So for me, March for Our Lives holds a lot of significance for today, but it also brings me back full circle to my roots. And I know that a lot of young people in this movement can connect with that. And one more thing that I think makes March for Our Lives different is how activism has become so accessible because of the nature of the fact that it was founded pretty much on social media. So you have kids that would have never even heard the word activism before that are getting engaged in their communities. We have resources that we're sending to kids that reach out to us on Instagram or Twitter to help organize their communities, to help take action. And I think that's really what makes us special. And I think that's what's going to continue making us special as long as we sustain the same energy that we have. And we're relying on that energy and all the other factors I mentioned before. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you for that. John, you spoke very briefly, so I'm just going to turn to you quickly with a question. Today, the House of Representatives held a hearing for an incredibly overdue piece of legislation, if I do say, on universal background checks. Do you think that that hearing would have happened without your work?
Realistically, no, because after Parkland, it kind of struck a chord in America. Every once in a while, you kind of see a mass tragedy that really grabs America's attention, like Sandy Hook, the Las Vegas shooting, Pulse. And unfortunately and fortunately, Parkland was one of those. And we were able to kind of capture everyone's attention and really hold elected officials accountable and keep that precedent on them until November 6th, when we see these record-breaking youth voter registration numbers and seeing how the youth really kind of took action and went out and used their voice and cast their ballot. And just constantly getting that pressure and seeing so many celebrities speak out about gun violence prevention and voting, especially. It doesn't even have to be about gun violence prevention, but just youth advocacy in general, and just kind of making that a part of our everyday lives. Because I know even before this, there was no candidates really focus on the 18 to 29 age bracket for voting, and especially for their campaigns. And I know that is such an important and key part that they should really put more focus towards, because this is the future of our country. You can relate to them, you know? If you target your 18 to 29 is the largest voting bracket in our country, and if you kind of tap into that age demographic, you can swing any election. And so, especially for us to really kind of speak out and talk about it and keep this conversation going, I don't think that our elected officials would listen, and we would just be going on without having these amazing pieces of legislation that are hitting our House, and we previously have been able to pass more than 70 plus pieces of legislation for gun violence prevention across America since our organization has been founded, which has been less than a year. So pretty remarkable. But if you check our social medias, it's actually amazing, because we have, I believe, more than like 60 young people in the hearing, sitting down, just watching everything happen. And that's just another factor of showing that these elected officials, that we're here, we still care, and we're still gonna make our voice heard. Because if we're just behind, yes, we can use our cell phones and use the use of social media, which has been a huge help, especially for growing this movement. However, showing up and showing them that this is not something that we'll just tweet out or we'll make an Instagram post about it. This is something that we care about, and has what Avalon said about how this is our everyday life. This is not just like a side job or like a fun little hobby. This is something that we are truly a part of, because the youth really needs to take a step in the political arena and really start to get engaged. And gratefully, we're finally seeing that, and I'm glad to be a part of that process. So,
thank you. When I was in graduate school, I studied social movement organizations as a thing, and they had many characteristics to them. And I'm thinking now, as both of you were talking, that March for Our Lives, is that even an organization? We've reconceptualized social movement organizations in cyberspace. And I think that in and of itself is fascinating. So I'm going to take us down a little more of an academic journey now. And Elham, I'm very curious to hear more about your work and your thinking.
Thank you for inviting me. The story of social movements and the women's movement in particular in Iran didn't just start with revolution, but the revolution allowed a lot of religious women to come to the public arena. And then as their rights were taken away from them, they mobilized, and social media in the past 15 years or so, and the internet, have allowed them to make connections that were not possible before. So a lot of rural women joined in, because now we have the phenomena of mobile and can go anywhere, and it's small and it's not like a computer. And it also made transnational ties possible. So with women who had fled Iran, they were able to still be connected, and it made a huge difference, I think, in how women's movement have been played out in Iran. It is a cat and mouse game, though, that they play with the government, because the government does come after them, and there is a certain anonymity within the social movement that they can have, but at one point, from one point on, that is not possible, and once they get known, then they get arrested and oppressed. I think that's also why after 2009 unrest in Iran, with all the potentials that social movement had, it was not able to lead anywhere, because at the center of it there was no leaders. Because social media and internet was allowed to make ties and make the circulation of news very accessible to all, but it also meant that it didn't have the leadership that the previous organized traditional social movements had. And so therefore it didn't lead to victory. And this is a problem that they're still grappling with, not only the women's movement, but also the oppositional movement in Iran and the reformists. Yeah, that's about it, and I'm open to questions.
That's a teaser. I think that there's more, and we can certainly come back to it. So Tony, take us on a journey of what your thinking is these days and what your research is showing.
So my name is Tony Hatch. I'm a professor of science and society at Wesleyan University. And the comments that have already been made about social movements, about politics, governance, and power take me back actually to a situation regarding black people in this country. And it takes me back to a gentleman by the name of David Walker. If you don't know who David Walker is, you need to educate yourself about who this man was. David Walker was a free black man and a very, very early abolitionist in this country. And David Walker self-published what he called his appeal to the people, to the colored people of the world, but especially here in the United States. This was in the late 1700s, David Walker's appeal. He lived in Boston. He self-printed this appeal and had it distributed in the most surreptitious, covert, I guess you could think about it as 18th century encryption. He was a tailor, and he would print copies of this appeal, which was a very radical, revolutionary, militant text that urged the violent overthrow of the slaveocracy that was the United States, was, and I think still is, for at least vis-a-vis black people. So he printed this appeal and stitched it into the coat pockets of the jackets that he had tailored. And he had them sent down to the slaveholding South, where he hoped that the Negroes who worked in the doing the textile work in the South would get it off to the plantations. And this was a very early iteration of what you can think of as a technology, a technique, a way of building community, of educating, of radicalizing people to overthrow a political order that in no way regarded their lives as valuable. So both the March for Our Lives, which is expressing an urgent demand that our elected officials care for the bodies of our young people as they exist in school. That same dynamic has been in place with regard to people of African descent in this country since our inception as a so-called nation. So the piece that I wrote that, and I think inspired my invitation to this conference, looked at this question of how particularly black people have been subject to technological assault in this country via technologies. Technologies have been the instrument of subordination. And at the same time, they also can potentially, and this I think is an open question, can potentially serve as a means of resistance. And to me, that's where I just kind of, where my thought is, based on what I've heard already today, is how are we going to balance that dual-edged nature of technology? Technology both as a set of practices that cut and maim and harm, and as a set of practices and ideas that can connect and build and expand what it means to be human and to care for people. And I think that both of those dynamics are important, and I would encourage us as we go forward in this conversation to think much more expansively about what we mean when we say technology. It's not just digital stuff and computers. It's a practice, it's a way of doing a thing in a much more expansive sense. And so the ways of organizing, both in Iran, here in the US, are just simply ways of doing this work. So that's kind of where my thinking is in a preliminary sense.
Thank you for that. And the dual use that you described, the cutting and maiming or the building, it sort of harkens to the cat and mouse game that you mentioned, and certainly the sort of trolling environment that your activists live in. One of the questions people have about protest, I'm going to talk about protest, is that it's a necessity. It's a necessity in a healthy, thriving society to protest that which you see that needs change. We could argue political ads are a necessity in some regards. And we could also say there's necessity and there's pleasure in protest. There's reward that comes from the successes. There's reward that comes from growth of a movement. Perhaps this is a question for Tony and Elham. How do you see necessity and pleasure in protest in the particular illustrations that you're studying?
Yes, I think there's a self-growth that comes with it. And technologies in Iran have made it possible for a lot of religious women to also move into the public arena for the first time, because it allows them to be safe, it allows them to be anonymous to a certain degree, and to take part in a greater movement that they didn't have the right or the opportunities before. And it allows them to get to understand who they are, how they were raised, socialized into religious thinking about women, and then how they can free themselves. And there's a tremendous growth that comes with it. When I first started working on women's movement in Iran, I was interviewing this woman who had a magazine for religious women. Farzaneh was the name of the publication. She was like a mujtahid, a religious leader in her own right, and she had just come back from Iraq where she had studied, and she was completely muhajjabah, completely covered, and she was very adamant in her views. Today, she lives in Germany. She's no longer veiled, and she has one of the most progressive and amazing views that I've heard. And it allowed her to come to a self-realization about herself and how she grew up and what it means to work for women's movement. And I think it's really interesting. There are many other examples, and these examples also, indicate that there is a way there's a way in which the technology allows women to have access to things that they've never had access before to, and so they're able to explore things that they cannot explore just by going to university. They cannot explore by just being active. It comes with protesting after you know what are the things that are denied to you. So that's what I think has made it possible for a lot of women to come to this self-realization. And yes, protest, I think, has, and they pay a huge cost for it too. You know, a lot of them go to exile or go to prison or so forth, but it allows them to grow and find a sense of community that is worth fighting for.
To follow up briefly, could you give us a sense of the digital platforms that are being used? You know, we sort of shorthand a lot of conversation with March for Our Lives around Twitter, as mentioned. What are the platforms? What are women using?
The blogs were very important in Iran when it first started in the late 1990s. That's where we saw an outpouring of women's writing. There is some use of Twitter. There's a lot of use of Facebook in Iran, and blogs haven't died, so they're still there. And then different part. I mean, Telegram is another thing that's very popular in Iran. And it's kind of like WhatsApp that has that kind of a function, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, works in that way too, in terms of the possibilities for a distribution of news. And so that's what they use a lot. Yeah, these are all that I can think of.
Telegram? I'm making a note of that. Thank you. Tony, did you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'm struck by our reliance on these, I guess, these technology companies for these platforms. I have a confession, and it's very simple. I just joined Twitter like last week, and I instantly regretted my decision. It was an instantaneous moment of revulsion and curiosity. And I texted a good friend of mine, and she said, "Why on God's name did you join Twitter?" So the concern I have for people's movements around the world, we're talking about the great masses of humanity who are not thriving right now. You asked about the desire and resistance. People, this is not an academic skill. This is about survival. And so the great concern I have is that we are relying on our rulers for the platforms through which we protest the fact of our being ruled. And that is a paradox I cannot get my mind around right now. Honestly, we're relying on them to provide us with the means by which we connect with each other, to connect, to strategize. One case in point, and this is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been surveilled and countermanded and undermined in digital space since its inception. And so it's no longer a safe space. And it just reminds me, that this is one last point, that the internet was a military application. It was a military application. I started college at Dartmouth in 1994. We knew this. We had Netscape 1.0 operating on our Mac machines. I guess they were Macs at the point. But it was a military application. So the presumption that the world's masses are going to achieve any modicum of freedom or liberation by using these platforms that have been set up for these purposes, I question that. And I hope that at some point we can talk about that today, tomorrow, if we make it.
That paradox, it just kind of makes me sink down in my chair. It's bewildering.
This is not a happy panel.
We're supposed to be, though. So remember, this is the happy panel. But I want to take one of your points about access and come back to March for Our Lives. And in particular, John, you've talked about and you've written about or tweeted about finding new communities to be involved. How do you think about the fact that some of those communities may not have access to the same tools as you, and how do you reach them?
Well, realistically, I really think that a lot of people, especially young people, have access to social media, and especially the ones we reach, because a big part for gun violence, it happens in inner cities and urban communities so much more than rural. And it happened to us once. It happened to my school once. However, this is a day-to-day common underlying theme in these marginalized communities like Detroit and Philadelphia and all these places that have a lot of either gang violence or places that they just aren't. They don't have the proper resources, as you said. And I remember going over the summer, we went on a tour called Road to Change. It was a voting initiative just to target the youth and show them the power of their voice. This was through voter registration, as I said, and panels, rallies, public demonstrations. And on the road, we stopped by, one of our first stops was Chicago, which is ravaged by gun violence. And we were talking to the local kids, and they were really saying that this all stems from schools, because their schools are not properly funded, they don't have the proper resources, they don't have clubs that they can go to after school, so kids decide to join gangs. They decide to have alternate hobbies, if you will. If we fix the root of the problem, which is elected officials, because the elected officials decide what the budget is. They decide how much money will go into the schools. And it's a direct pipeline between the schools into jails, because once you get into the schools that do not have proper resources and won't give these kids a proper shot at a good life, it's inevitable that they're going to find alternatives that aren't going to be the best. One of the girls, her name was Elham, she was really talking about how social media was really her outlet, because she got to talk and connect and find her own educational tools and learn about what's happening on the news and kind of give herself the resources because her schools wouldn't, and keep her busy that way. And she said that with the power of social media, she learned about March for Our Lives. She learned about these other Black Lives Matter, all these other incredible movements that really kind of shaped the way that she perceived the world and what she could do and how she can engage and how she could use her very own voice. And she actually was able to tag along on the tour with us. And what we were able to do was every stop that we had more than 50 stops over the summer, and 2 tours, one Florida, and then moved up to also do the Freedom Riders tour, which was Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, a few more. But we made it a mission to have local kids join our tour every time we took a stop, so we could give them the experience and give them the opportunity to make their voices heard, because we have our own perspective, especially the original co-founders of March for Our Lives. We all were from Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and we kind of all live the same reality. However, it is so much more important and better to bring more seats to the tables with different perspectives, when they have different life experiences and can educate a whole new demographic and a whole new crowd. That's where you really can kind of get the conversation going.
Could I also answer that as well? So I think that's something really important for me. When I first got involved in March for Our Lives, was understanding that I didn't know all the answers, and that although I have experiences with trauma and pain, there have been communities that have been touched by trauma in ways that I don't understand, generational trauma stemming back to when something actually, a really interesting quote that I had heard on Martin Luther King Day was actually a video of Martin Luther King speaking about the nature of communities of color and black people in this country and how they're different than other immigrant groups in this country, and the fact that they didn't immigrate here. They were forcefully taken out of their own communities to be here and are the only group of people to ever be enslaved on American soil. And so understanding that I don't have all the answers kind of gave me an idea for the framework that we have to use when organizing, especially in those communities that don't have access to social media. Because I'm positive if there are kids who can't have access to food, for example, 85% of kids in Brentwood School District, which is 35 minutes away from where I live, don't have access to adequate meals on the weekends. They don't have food security. I'm sure that these kids don't have the same access to social media and technology that I do, or that other kids in this movement do. So I think the work really comes all the way back to grassroots organizing. March for Our Lives is not the first gun violence organization to ever exist. We're not the first community organization to ever exist. There have been countless people that have been organizing their communities for decades and decades and decades. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the intersections of oppression that they're caught in, they haven't been heard. Their voices haven't been heard. They've been suppressed when it comes to voting. Their community leaders refuse to listen to them because they have certain perceptions of what these communities are like. And so they've been disadvantaged. And I think that the one thing that March for Our Lives can do is not take over the organizing in these communities, but rather partner with these communities, listen to them, hear them, understand their pain, and then try to give them the platform that we have. And give them the resources that we have, the monetary resources, the public resources in terms of the branding of March for Our Lives. When you hear March for Our Lives, you think of a very specific thing. In my opinion, I kind of think of like a group of teens who have made it cool to be involved with activism. But for a lot of teens, this isn't obviously just, it's not a cool thing, it's a matter of survival. And so I think that the way that you combat the issue of kids not having access to media or technology is by doing the work. There's a way that people romanticize protest, and I think ever since 2016 I've seen it more than ever, where the idea of going to protest is a fun Sunday afternoon activity for privileged white women who don't have anything else to do. And I think that that's a really big issue, especially in the progressive movement, at least from what I've seen. It's kind of this idea that protest is something you do for fun, when protest shouldn't be done for fun. It should be done with purpose. It should be done with a solid message, and it should be done with goals. And I think that I'm finally starting to see that among youth of all races, of all backgrounds, of all socioeconomic statuses. And I think that's the most important thing, is not to let protest become an activity, but rather an action step, and to not let protest simply accumulate in Instagram posts, but to let it accumulate in tangible change in our communities. And like I said, I think that begins with really doing the work and not just saying you're going to do it, but really going into communities and being there and being a true ally, rather than just saying you're going to do something that you know you're not going to do.
Absolutely, an important point on the physicality of the work. And you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to say something added to what Anthony was saying. It is like a military tool, the internet, when you come to think of it. And in Iran, what's happening is that there's an overwhelming youth population who's doing this without having the proper discipline. And I think you can say the same thing about Arab Spring too. Because when you're dealing with a technology that is so deep and so horizontal, it goes around and can connect everybody to everyone. You gotta have the discipline in order to move it forward. But they lack the discipline. They lack the kind of discipline that the nonviolence movement, such as the civil rights movement that we've had in the US had. And these two factors combined have made it extra hard for the youth in these countries to be able to use it as really something that could further their cause. So being young and not having the discipline that the real nonviolence movements need, and they go through trainings. It's not easy. You just don't just talk about it. You have to have proper leadership, proper organization to teach the youth how to deal with violence that is being used against them. So I think that's what's lacking in the Middle East.
Thank you. Yes.
I mean, this is a great point. And I think it really raises a really important question for us in this conference. It's about the greater good. Well, who's good are we talking about? And what's good? I'm from Atlanta, so that's a phrase they have, what's good, down there. And I think we'd be naive sitting in this room to think that simply because we want a better world, that's somehow going to be enough. There are people who are working actively to ensure that this situation does not change. So, to your point that movements today, this is true for March for Our Lives as well, have to think very strategically about how they're going to intervene on systems and institutions that are by definition impervious to transformation. So how are we going to transform social institutions that are designed not to change? What tactics and strategies are we going to deploy collectively to achieve transformation, and to what end? Who is going to benefit? I think that's a huge question for us. I mean, seriously, just kind of deconstructing the panel group, like, what are we going to do? Who's going to benefit? History teaches us anything is that every transformation ends up, at least in the last 500 years, with some new arrangement where those who ruled before rule us now differently. So presumably we want that to end, right? Presumably, that's the assumption. So what are we going to do?
Okay, so what are we going to do? I think that the applause is warranted, for starters. And I'd like to certainly have time to hear from those of you. I hear various murmurs as we've been talking. And so to lead us into your questions, I would circle back to some comments in the first panel about working in the interest of me versus working in the interest of us. I would raise the question of transparency in social movements. I would raise the question of the culture of involvement versus just the broader culture, the broader population, and the differences that exist. And let's talk more. So I think now we'll travel a microphone. What about all of you who've been murmuring? Say it out loud. I want to hear some of the thoughts. Hi. Sure.
I can just yell.
There you go.
I've been wondering a lot about, specifically with what you just ended with, how do you change these systems and these structures that have been here for so long, and they feel like they're never going to change, especially in other countries where it's extremely corrupt, and then you also have foreign powers that prefer the system the way it is because it's simply easier to deal with it this way. I don't know if you have any kind of insight into when do you truly see like complete structural change in different societies.
I'm hesitant to answer because to me it's a simple, I'll break it down simply from my own point of view. Are we going to reform the institutions we have and keep them more or less intact, right? This would be akin to giving the slave like 2 crusts of bread versus 1. You know, give them 2 pair of shoes instead of 1 pair of shoes. We'll give you a little bit more, but not enough to where you really are gonna thrive. This is reform. This is the crisis of liberalism we're talking about. Or are we going to open up our minds and our political thought to a much more expansive, and I think it's a tired word, but radical conception of the way our world should be organized. We have a situation where half the people on the planet are barely surviving, y'all. Barely. And it's a situation, so you know, I live in this contradictory space where I want to reform and make good, reasonable, intelligent progress, right? That only a fool wouldn't want progress. But at the same time, I've been yearning for some time for something much more transformative, and that's going to mean me giving up privilege. And a lot of us giving up the cheddar we hold and stop hoarding shit.
Anthony Hatch, 2020, ladies and gentlemen.
Can I add something?
Please.
I think it also means being inclusive and understanding that you were never going to exclude or eliminate those who oppose you. This is something I learned from the mourning mothers in Iran, the mothers who lost their kids. And one of them told me one time that, I know that the next kid on the next blog is from a religious family and is totally against our family and what we stand for, and he could be one of the killers. But I know in the next Iran that we are trying to create, he is going to be among us, and we are not going to eliminate people like him. So we will exist with him, and the answer that she gave me was to be inclusive and to understand that you'll never going to eliminate religious elements or religious communities or people who believe in militant ways. But the idea is to be able to make the greater good appealing to them so that they could have a space in the next society, in the ideal society.
Thank you for that as well. Mourning mothers is such a powerful label. And I'm also reminded of a piece of the American gun violence and gun safety movement, anti-gun violence, gun safety movement, and that is actually of mothers as well. A massive organization, grassroots organization called Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America that started with a woman who just put something on Facebook after hearing the news of the tragedy at Sandy Hook. There was no hierarchy in mind, there was no structure in place, there was no grand scheme. It was just an act of conscience that they now very proudly use that label, moms, and it's a powerful label, much like mourning mothers as well. Moms demanding action is a very powerful phrase too. So as much as we know that your demographic is carrying water, there's upwards of 5 million moms and people who believe in that cause too. So it's this, the moment that we're in this country, I think, is allowing for that kind of, there can be different collective identities that people take on. You know, you're holding on to youth as identity. For some women, it's motherhood as the identity that fuels the activism. And it's fascinating to see all of this coming together. And I think for the sake of this group, for all of us, the goal is to see that change occur. And I'm thinking of Kathleen Hall Jameson's really provocative point about substance-based primaries. And I'd love to see some gun violence primaries. But the thing is, I think we already had some, and I think they were in November. And I think that we may stand to see real change. And that could be a marvelous outcome, despite the fact that we are indeed living in the very paradoxes that we've also addressed today. So in the interest of time, yes, more questions, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this great conversation. My name is Marcella Vituli. I'm digital director at an organization called Community Change. We're one of the ones that have been doing community organizing for 50 plus years now. So this is a great opportunity for me to talk with the next generation. My question is related to using technology to reach people who are traditionally difficult to reach. So undocumented communities who are extremely skeptical about technology. Traditionally marginalized communities who, frankly don't give a damn how fancy your social movement is or what channels you're on, because they have not seen the material means of their lives or the lives of their families improve no matter who's in office. I would love to talk to you all and hear your reflections on how we can use some of the tools that are so powerful today to reach these folks in a way that is comfortable for them, but that also allows our organizers in communities to do the real work. Getting them in the door, though, seems to require a lot of digital solutions or tools these days. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
And before we jump in, we just have a couple of minutes left, if I'm reading this right. So there may be a necessity to have some of that conversation over cocktails, which doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world at all. But if there's a quick answer that anyone would like to provide, if not, I think that bridges us very well into more conversation.
So obviously I don't have the amount of experience that you would have or that your organization would have, but I think, and I don't have a very clean-cut answer for you, but I think the issue that you're speaking of is kind of this loss of trust. And I think that before even talking about the technologies that we need to use to access these communities and the ways that we can activate these communities, I think it needs to go back to the conversation of how do we restore trust in these communities that America has failed for so very long. And like John was saying earlier, I think that comes back to addressing these systems that have disproportionately disadvantaged so many communities in this country for so long, and actually doing tangible, meaningful, real change. And like Anthony was saying, not just ones that kind of look out on the outside and that appeal to the masses, but a real tangible change and creating trust so they don't feel that hesitancy to use these technologies. And like I said, I don't have a clean answer, but for me that seems to be the intuitive way that I would think about that. Yeah.
Just super quick, because I know we're at time. But it reminds me of something that the great philosopher Flavor Flav once said. Can't trust it. You can't trust it. And the other quick response is, we just had a new month, so my family, we paid bills. How much was your Verizon bill this month? We don't have unlimited data in my family, but my Verizon bill was $120. And so that's like a trip to the grocery store. So you cannot overcome the problem of access in a society as patently unequal as this one. So we got to go back to old school, boots on the ground, walk in the neighborhood type stuff.
Amen to that. And for those of you who are new to the work, and those of you who've been looking at the work, and those of you who've been doing the work for a very long time, thank you. Let's keep going, and let's do it over cocktails. Thanks again to our panel.
Three quick things here. Thank you for coming. Come back tomorrow. And as Tracy said, we've got a lot of food and drink out there, so please consume it. And the whole idea is to have a conversation. So get out there and talk with our panelists and our guests. Thank you.